All right, come on in, everybody. Welcome back to the Holler. TNHoller.com is where you can find us at the TN Holler on Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and Instagram, Threads. We're everywhere. And you can also find us hollering all across the state. Thanks to your support, your small dollar monthly donations keep us going. And as always, we want to shout out Elisa Parker for her continued support of what we do. If you're buying or selling a home in Middle Tennessee, do it through her. If you need a lawyer, Abby Rubenfeld. And if you need some jewelry, Mary, AJ Martin is where you should go. They're very supportive of us. I already told Mary this, but I'm dealing with some terrible allergies, so please forgive me. I'm going to do the best I can not to sneeze into this microphone. Today, we're talking to Mary Batiwalla, who was formerly the Assistant Education Commissioner here in Tennessee and has a unique perspective on some of the things that has been happening around here. We talk about education a lot. We're obviously big supporters of public education here at the Holler, and we have our thoughts about some of the moves that have been made throughout the Governor Lee administration. And Mary's here to share her perspective on some of those things. Mary, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you? Sorry about your allergies.
Yeah, I know. I think I'm allergic to my cockapoos, and it's not great, but they're worth it. They're so cute. Uh, before we get into the education stuff, obviously, just want to mention that Gloria Johnson is now running for Senate. Uh, there's been a lot of excitement about her campaign. We're going to have her on at some point. I was there for her launch in Nashville. There was a lot of enthusiasm around that. So we'll get her on here at some point, but make sure to check out her launch video. And she is challenging Marsha Blackburn, who we are no fans of here at the Holler. I'm not speaking for Mary. I only speak for myself. Mary, so I guess before we get into why you're on here, I want to talk to you about the letter grades that are potentially going to be assigned to Tennessee schools through the quote unquote accountability effort from the Lee administration. If you could just tell us what your role was in the education department and when that was.
Yeah, so I joined the Tennessee Department of Education in 2013. I started off working on the research and policy team, and then I was promoted into a role where I was the executive director of accountability. So I directly led the efforts to create systems to hold schools and districts accountable. And then from there, I took the role of assistant commissioner. So in total, I was at the department for a little over 6.5 years. Even when I was on the research and policy team, one of my main responsibilities was working on accountability systems. So it's an area where I've spent quite a lot of time working, thinking, and collaborating.
So what's going on with accountability right now? The push to assign letter grades, that's something that's kind of right in your wheelhouse. And I want to talk about that. First, I just want to hear a little bit about you did have some overlap into the Lee administration. Is that right? And at what point were you transitioned out of there?
Correct. So I spent about 8 months working under the Lee administration. I resigned, and my last month was in August 2019. So I was there for about 8 months. Most of the time, Penny Schwinn was also there as the commissioner.
And may I ask the reason that you resigned?
Well, this could be a full conversation in and of itself, but I think I
Let's
would
have
say,
it.
I think I would say, most concisely, I could not be an effective leader under the administration of Penny Schwinn. There were some key policy differences that I had. She was actually trying to do some accountability changes towards my last few months in the role, but overall, her administration was chaotic and disorganized and not conducive to being able to effectively manage a team within the Department of Education organization.
So let me just say that's not the first time I have heard that about Penny Schwinn's reign. And obviously, she represents Governor Lee. I mean, she was his choice. So before we move to this accountability piece, I kind of want to drill down on that for 1 second and just ask, can you elaborate a little bit about what the policy differences were that you had with Penny Schwinn?
Well, there are a few. As it pertains to accountability, it was mostly around her push, as is the push now, to make significant changes to our system that emphasized absolute achievement over improvement, which is a key philosophical difference between Tennessee and almost every state in this country when it comes to accountability. There were also, at that time, many challenges we were trying to resolve with assessment. And we had worked very hard to ensure a smooth administration in 2019. This is something that Penny was not quite as excited about to have a smooth administration. So I think she was looking more to have disruptions such that then the following year things could go smoothly under her full administration. So there were just some key
so just to
differences.
Right, and I understand, and your concerns were that the way they were going to measure accountability was not going to paint an accurate picture of the way
Exactly.
schools were conducting themselves in Tennessee. Is that fair to say?
Exactly. And we can get into this, but most accountability systems that are used are primarily focused on absolute achievement. Schools and districts account for at best 20% of absolute test scores. Therefore, when we did extensive outreach, looked into the evidence, when we were assembling how we were going to approach A through F accountability, which is in state law. That's a whole other thing we can get into, right? Excel and Ed worked really hard for years to get a law passed so that we were forced into an A through F system. But
okay, wait, time
yeah.
out. And I'm a layman on this, so I just
Yeah.
want to, and I think people that are watching are going to need some of this defined a little. Excel in education is where our current Tennessee Department of Education commissioner came from, right? Lizette Gonzalez Reynolds is the new hire who just replaced Penny Schwinn. And there it is in the Tennessee. And it says Reynolds comes to Tennessee from the education group Excel in Ed. What is Excel in Ed?
Yeah, so Excel and Ed is a foundation that was originally founded by Jeb Bush after he finished his term or towards the end of his tenure as the governor of Florida. And the foundation is solely focused on education. So they're not focused on other areas or policy areas. And they have about 8 priorities. And one of their key priorities is school accountability, specifically pushing states to pass laws that require all schools be graded with an A through F letter grade. And their organization has, folks that work on programs. I think they have 2 arms similar to a lot of foundations, one of which is a lobbying arm. And so the lobbying arm has worked since the beginning at Excel and Ed to really go to states and lobby general assemblies to pass these A through F laws. And that's exactly what
Why do
happened
they
here.
want it to be an A through F letter grade?
They believe that the A through F letter grade is the most transparent and digestible way to communicate to parents about schools. So a large part of their beliefs around accountability have to do with reporting to a parent audience on how schools are performing using this metric that they believe is digestible. All students get A through Fs in schools, in most schools, and they thought this system was the best way to communicate the grade.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to offer my kind of hypothesis about the Lee administration and Penny and where this all comes from. And I am open to being told I'm completely off base about this. But my fear, and I think the fear of a lot of public education advocates in Tennessee, is that the Lee administration and Penny by extension have not had the best interests of our public schools at heart. And Governor Lee's main priority when he took office were these private school vouchers, and then charter schools, and an appeal board that overrules local decisions denying charter schools, and Hillsdale. And it seems like Governor Lee has been the tip of the privatization spear in Tennessee that seeks to essentially make public schools uncomfortable in various ways and steer as many of these public education taxpayer dollars to private entities, charter organizations, private schools as possible, and essentially is a fox guarding the henhouse of public education in Tennessee. Now, I don't know you that well. You don't have to agree with me, but I would ask, with your knowledge of the way things work in our education system, how far off am I?
Well, let's go with your first statement. I think it's a reasonable statement to make that the governor and the Department of Education right now are not focused on driving policies in education that are based on what the people of Tennessee have asked for. I think if you've watched any of the town hall meetings that they've been conducting recently, the department's gone out to 10 different cities and asked folks for their input on changes to accountability. If you've watched those, you'll see that the things that people are asking for are not aligned with what the department is ultimately pushing behind closed doors. There is, even when I was at the department, most of the time under the Haslam administration, it would be naive for anyone to believe that special interests have not continuously been trying to push their agenda in Tennessee, whatever that agenda is. And we can see in Tennessee, part of that at least is the voucher interest, right? But under Lee's administration, he has been much more successful. I'll tell you, the first meeting, even before Penny Schwinn got here, that I had with the administration was late February, right after Lee took office. I was called in by the governor's chief of staff at the time. And I was told that we would have vouchers. It was not a question of if, it was when. And I was asked to provide feedback on whether those students that accepted vouchers should have to be taking a test or have some mechanism of accountability to receive the dollars. At the time, it was like kind of a outlandish conversation. I couldn't believe there'd be a world where any state government would consider giving state taxpayer dollars to a student to go to a school and wouldn't expect some sort of accountability. But at the this was in the first weeks of the administration, that's what they were thinking. And ultimately, if we look to Florida to see what has happened with vouchers over the course of the last 10 years, this year in Florida, for the first time, vouchers are available to anyone. They're not means tested. That means there's no income requirement. And in Florida, when they started the voucher program back in 2010 or so, students were required to take the state test if they took a voucher. They haven't been required to take the state test for years in Florida for the students who've received the vouchers. So what do you lose? Well, you lose a measure of accountability. You also lose the ability to measure how these students who are receiving taxpayer dollars to go to private schools are being served, right? And so I would not disagree with you that part of this has to do with voucher pushes. There could be other things as well. The main concern to me is the fact right now the department is attempting to hijack the accountability system to move it from what right now is theoretically a mechanism for school improvement to a mechanism that is used to say, look how bad schools are. Here's some other alternative options, right? If you want to do vouchers, right? You don't have to necessarily hijack this mechanism for improvement, but that's the playbook of Excel and Ed. That's their play. That is their playbook. How they get there, and it's really unfortunate that they believe that these two things have to be intertwined.
Well, and it sounds like what you're saying is that they are not necessarily coming at this from a place of, how can we make public schools as good as they can possibly be and as strong as they can possibly be? And so, the next question in my mind is, okay, so what is their motive? And it seems like their motive is to essentially steer these vast resources dedicated to public schools in Tennessee and in the country. I mean, Betsy DeVos was a part of the voucher push in Tennessee and has openly said that her agenda was to steer public taxpayer dollars to private religious schools, advancing God's kingdom. I actually have a clip of it that I can show you here, but I want to stay talking to you for a minute. So, this accountability effort happening right now, kind of under the cover of this special session that we just had, where people aren't really paying attention to what's going on with these town halls, except the people that are actually in the town halls. This seems like the next front in the push to paint public schools in Tennessee as a failure. Is that fair to say?
Correct. Any system that looks primarily at absolute achievement in schools, it's creating a false narrative. It's funny because they have a great talking point, right? These people that push these absolute achievement systems, because their talking point is you're lying to parents. This school only has 14% proficiency, and you're going to say it's doing good and not automatically give it an F. But this is school accountability. What is the school doing? That is why improvement is so important, because the school, the district, does not control the vast majority of what goes into an absolute achievement score. What they do control is improving, growing their students. All kids are capable of learning. All kids are capable of mastering our standards. But within 1 year, if you have a student who comes in at a first grade reading level when they're in fourth grade, is it reasonable to expect that teacher to have that student proficient in fourth grade? What are you asking? You're asking for them to grow their students, for them to improve. I argue it's actually the opposite. You are lying to parents when you say that a school with high achievement scores in a rich, affluent suburb automatically gets an A and say that school's doing good. A school with rich, affluent students that has high proficiency, I have no idea whether that school is doing good things for us. Are they growing them? Do they improve them? Or do they have these high scores simply because of out of school factors? I wouldn't expect anyone to be held accountable for something that they only control 20% of in their job, to have a raise depend on that, to have incentives depending on that. That's absurd. No one would think that was reasonable. And that's what they're aiming to do. They're aiming to make our system, which right now is completely improvement based. You can succeed solely by growing your students, improving. They want to make this system such that, certain schools are doomed to never be successful. And that's what happened under NCLB. Like, we've done all of this, right? Education is like a lot of policy areas. It's very cyclical. We did that, and it wasn't successful. But in doing this and using achievement, you ensure not just that many schools are labeled failing, you ensure that certain schools are failing. And that's a big important component, because it wasn't just that when we ran our system originally, when Penny was there, when I was still there, that there were a good amount of schools that got A's. It was the type of schools that got A's.
Well, elaborate on that. You say certain schools, the type of schools. When I hear that, I hear, majority minority schools
That's right.
in Memphis, in Nashville,
In
Shelby,
Chattanooga.
Davidson counties, and Chattanooga, these schools that they are trying to paint as failing schools. And in general, those are the schools with a lot of minority kids. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. Because under an absolute achievement system, again, where absolute achievement is controlled 80% by things that are not under the school or district's purview, absolute achievement tends to be low. That's when those students deserve to learn. They deserve to have the best opportunities. And if the school that they come to is growing them and improving them, that's what they should be held accountable for. I mean, that's the ultimate aim.
Right. So they're basically saying, okay, we're going to level the playing field and measure everybody by the same thing. But what you're saying is the playing field is not level. You've got kids in poor communities with, parents who don't have the ability to, pay property taxes that go to these schools that have all the resources. And so if you measure it by growth, you're basically saying, okay, how did this student do from when they got there to what, to now, as opposed to measuring them against, you know, Williamson County schools where, these kids have every resource in the world. And, that's a way to set these Memphis and Nashville schools up for failure, and they know it.
And back to your point, where do voucher programs exist? Where are their voucher programs implemented right now? That's where they're
In
implemented.
those counties.
That's
In
right.
those counties, because when those vouchers passed, Republican reps made sure that vouchers did not come to their own communities and counties. They only wanted them to be in these majority Black, democratically represented areas so that they didn't have to deal with the parents who were upset about these things as steering taxpayer dollars to private schools. So I think you're connecting a lot of the dots for us, and that's really important to understand. One of the other measurements that you took issue with in your Twitter feed, which is something that we've been talking about a lot, so I was happy to see that you mentioned it, was the third grade retention law and the way that Governor Lee has painted it as measuring reading proficiency, even though that is not what TCAP measures. So in this ABC 24 Memphis article, it says that you said a student failing TCAP's reading portion does not mean they cannot read, but that they did not meet state standards. Meanwhile, Governor Lee is out there saying that all of these kids can't read because of what they scored on the TCAP test, also ignoring the fact that approaching reading ability was not included in those numbers. So do you feel like they're being misleading in the way that they're portraying the performances on the TCAP tests across the state?
Yeah, I do feel it's misleading to use the third grade TCAP as a measurement of whether students can read, because the third grade ELA assessment, we call it actually the English language arts assessment, it's not the reading assessment, measures state standards for English language arts in third grade. And there are some standards that cover foundational literacy skills, but there are a lot of standards that go beyond that, right? And so using it as the measure to say these students cannot read, and thus we're going to retain them if they don't follow some complicated, complex web policy, right? It's not an honest conversation to have. This was a policy that came to Tennessee, like a lot of policies in education, but in other areas too, come to Tennessee from other states, right? So this is something that Mississippi has. This is something that Alabama has. Again, this is one of those policies that some special interest goes around and lobby states to implement. That's what happened. The difference is that the other states that implemented this policy actually use a test that is a reading test to implement it. Now, Tennessee is using different tests for summer school, for the fall measurement, but the first test that it uses to implement this policy is our TCAP assessment, not a reading assessment. So we kind of like half stole the policy, but didn't follow through with another key component of implementation that other states used.
And even TCAP doesn't say it's a reading proficiency test. And it's administered by this company, Pearson, that just got another multi-million-dollar contract. So private entities are filling their pockets all along the way, every step of the way. And that seems to be the recurring theme with so many of these policies that are implemented by our Governor Lee's administration and the Tennessee Department of Education, and not just Governor Lee. I mean, I think this has been going on for a while, but it definitely feels like these are not policies that are being put in place with students at top of mind. And it feeds this narrative about our public schools underperforming, which at the end of the day is the driving force behind their ability to steer money and let's be clear, it's about money away from our public schools into private hands. And, wherever you stand ideologically, whether you're Democrat or Republican, generally speaking, our public schools are popular. Your own local public school is popular. You like your public school. You like your public school teachers. So they can't be out there railing against public schools openly. They have to act like they are defending public schools while they take resources from public schools. And that's why I keep saying it's the fox guarding the hen house. And so I know that you can't necessarily tell me what you think their specific motivations are, but it feels like you're able to say that you don't necessarily think this Tennessee Department of Education is putting students first. Is that fair?
Correct. And to your point, I do not believe this is a partisan issue at all, actually. Education policy is kind of a weird landscape in general, right? Where it doesn't cut clear across partisan lines. But my question is that this is where the policy difference is. If you say schools are bad, if you just say all these schools are bad, which we've already established isn't really a true statement, because using absolute achievement to judge a school is not something that a school can, largely be held accountable for. But if you say all these schools are bad, what then? What happens? And I do think a large part of this is, in their minds, what happens is you bolster support for vouchers, because you say, well, we're going to provide you an alternative option. But to your point, and I like this question about how does the public feel about schools? How do parents feel about their schools? Well, there's a poll on this every single year. They say, parents, how do you rate your schools? And 55 to 60% every single year say my child's school is an A or a B. When Excel and Ed came to meet with us, I had a meeting with them back in 2016. They flew up here to talk about how the choices that we had collectively made with our public to implement accountability were the wrong choices. Because again, we focused on improvement. The question that I asked to them, and I will ask this question every day until I see the evidence, is, in the states that implement A through F, are parents less likely to say that their schools are A's or B's? Because if you believe, which Excel and Ed does believe, that A through F accountability works because you're being transparent with parents, that only happens if parents believe what you tell them about their schools. And we don't have a ton of evidence that that's the case. We don't. This is interesting. I want to revisit this on the religious point. Excel and Ed had a tweet maybe a week or two ago, and it was a link to a Wall Street Journal article. And the Wall Street Journal article was an editorial about the goodness of vouchers. I read it. There was not one mention about vouchers being good because they help improve student outcomes. Because we know that there's not solid evidence that they do, right? This entire editorial focused on the goodness of Florida's voucher program because it had increased enrollment in Catholic schools when every other state had decreased it. I'm a born and raised Catholic, but when it comes to public policy, I do not think we should be making decisions about judging schools and abandoning tools we have to help schools improve so that we can ultimately help Catholic schools increase their enrollment. And I don't think most people would agree with that either, right?
Right. And that is ultimately what I believe Governor Lee's goal is. He does come at this from a faith-based perspective. I don't fault anybody. I'm Jewish. I was bar mitzvahed at an Orthodox temple. To each their own, absolutely. But when you start taking public resources and steering them to private Christian schools and religious schools, now you've crossed the line. And I do think that is Governor Lee's goal. There was just a Supreme Court case that, decided that public dollars can be used for religious charter schools, which I think is probably the next step here in Tennessee and what he has in mind. I know the Hillsdale folks have that in mind. Murray County is dealing with an appeal to a school they rejected, an ACE school, American Classical Education, that's Hillsdale affiliated. They're now going to go to Governor Lee's rig board and probably get the local school board's decision overruled. So at the end of the day, I think all signs point to what you're saying, which is they're trying to increase vouchers, which choice is vouchers, so that you can take public dollars to private religious schools, public charter schools that also have a Christian undertone to them. And I do think that is the goal here. And so what do you think about that word school choice, or that phrase, because school choice gets thrown around a lot in Tennessee, and it feels like a euphemism for this privatization and religiousizing of our public education system?
I've been in education for 20 years now. I actually started as a classroom teacher, taught for 4 years. School choice has always been part of the policy environment as long as I've been involved in education. I think, and I don't have strong beliefs when it comes to school choice. I haven't really worked in that arena. I will say when I started in education, school choice, there was small voucher programs, but it was largely charter schools, right? And, charter schools, vouchers, any of these mechanisms, they're not the silver bullet, right? There's good charter schools, there's bad charter schools. There's not a lot of good evidence on voucher programs, but I'm sure that there's good private schools and bad private schools. The problem to me is when the policy for public schools and the tools that we have are taken away or eroded because of these other policies. And that's my main concern. That's why I've been so vocal recently around accountability, because I believe deeply in accountability. I believe schools and districts should be held accountable. Tennessee spends a lot of money on public education in this state. It's our second largest expense. And we should have a policy measure that can help us understand whether or not they are improving outcomes for all students. My key concern is that we're making changes to the system motivated by other interests like privatization, rather than making decisions about helping schools improve. Because accountability systems, really what they are, is they're a way to single your values. What do we value as a state? And tying supports to the things we hold you accountable for. And it feels like those supports are going to be pretty much taken away, eroded, as other policy choices like privatization are used as the answer. And again, we're lying to parents when we say that schools are bad just because of absolute achievement. Talk to anyone in education. Educators know in Tennessee that growth and improvement is what matters. And you know what? The Excel and Ed people, they know it too. You know how I know that they know it? Because when I go and read the reports on how voucher programs are doing, do you know what they measure their success by? Not absolute achievement. They measure it by improvement. Of course, in Florida, they don't have the state test, but they do take a nationally normed test. And their key headline is students in voucher programs grew on average at least one grade level. They know that improvement is what schools and districts are responsible for. They know that that's what matters. The state knows that's what matters. Go look at last year's press release when Penny was still here and we released state test scores. Did they say only 40% of Tennessee students can read? This is the worst. Governor Lee might have said it to support his retention bill. But what does the press release say? There's quotes from legislators, SCORE, I'm sure, superintendents. It's all about, look, we improved 4 percentile points, right? Because that's what matters. Improvement is what we measure. And in Tennessee, we have a very strong history because we have a value added system. And it's been in place since I was a student in Tennessee public schools. And I think that that's
So
one thing that outsiders underestimate. I think that they are very frustrated. They haven't pushed what they wanted in this state. And I'll just say this
yeah.
because I don't think they understand the environment they're walking into in Tennessee. In most states, the understanding of accountability by educators and leaders, I'm not talking about parents. Accountability is super complicated for your average person to understand. But in Tennessee, our educators, our leaders especially, have a pretty good understanding. They have some problems with it. They think it's a little too complicated. Sure. But they have this deep belief in the notion of growth and improvement. And that's because we've been focused on growth and improvement in the state for decades.
Well, you make a lot of sense. Seeing Penny leave after the TISA funding formula was changed to tie more money to each kid so that when they do leave to go to charter schools, to go to other schools, they take more of the funding with them. It just seems like this has all been an effort to undermine our public schools led by the people at the very top. And, nothing you're saying here has dissuaded me of that. So I really appreciate you sharing your opinion. Everybody should follow you. It's at Batiwalla on Twitter. Mary Batiwalla, who was the Assistant Department of Education Commissioner in the very beginning of Penny Schwinn's reign. Is there anything else you want to share with people before we go?
I would just let you all know that they are accepting feedback at the Tennessee Department of Education. I think the feedback generally is a little bit of a show because I know behind the scenes they've pretty much made the decisions they think are going to be the decisions that they're going to go with. But being vocal, reaching out to your state senators or state representatives is really the most helpful way to go. In fact, I would encourage you to reach out directly to your representatives and not the department when it comes to sharing any concerns or feedback you have on what the department is attempting to do with accountability and their ultimate aims.
It seems like the feedback has always been a lot of bit of a show with the Lee administration. I've seen them ask for feedback on many things from Medicaid block grant to gun safety policies to education. And even though the comments overwhelmingly go one way or another, the Lee administration doesn't seem to change what they're doing at all. So I agree. Go to your reps, tell them how you feel, weigh in on the accountability policy town halls that are going on right now and are very under the radar because everybody has been so focused on the gun safety laws, and that's probably by design. Mary, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, appreciate it. Have a good one.
You too. So that was Mary Batiwalla. She was the Department of Education commissioner. If you guys follow us at the Holler, we're constantly talking about how Governor Lee does not have the best interests of our public schools at heart or our students, and how he and Penny Schwinn have for a very long time been designing policy to hurt public schools, squeeze public schools, and steer resources from our public schools into private hands through vouchers, charters, all kinds of other ways, even the, book banning and the squeeze on divisive concept laws. This is all to make public schools look bad. And now this accountability piece, Mary knows a lot about. And she just said, basically, they are trying to design the way that we measure our schools in a way that hurts schools, especially in Memphis and Nashville, where families have fewer resources, higher levels of poverty. The schools have less to work with to make them look bad so that people are more inclined to embrace these private school vouchers to steer public school taxpayer dollars to private hands. That's what's going on. When you see it, when your eyes are open to it, it's so clear. Even the third grade retention law, where Mary just came on here and said, TCAP does not measure reading in that way. Even that is a way to make our public schools look bad. And Governor Lee stood in front of cameras a while back and said, "Oh, look, our kids are failing TCAP. That means they can't read." And that's simply not what it was. And here was that.
That's really hard. We know that when a child cannot read, it's very difficult on parents, both the situation of retention, but
So he says a child cannot read. That is not even what the testing company, Pearson, that designs the TCAP, says it measures. And that's by design. Governor Lee knows what he's doing when he says our kids can't read, because then everybody who sees him say that is out there telling their friends, our kids can't read. Our kids can't read. 60% of our kids can't read. That is not what this test measured. I took a sample of this test. It wasn't easy. You can read and still get these questions wrong. There were multiple questions that had multiple answers that seemed right, but here he is saying our kids can't read, our kids can't read, because he knows that line will get picked up by the Tennessean, by TV networks, and it'll get injected into the bloodline of the way we talk about public education in Tennessee. And ultimately, the worse our public schools look, the more money he can steer into the hands of his privatization cronies.
that's what's even worse for a kid, is to be pushed forward into grades when they can't read, and we almost assure their failure going forward. So this piece of legislation is modeled after legislation in other states that we've seen really have great effect.
And Mary just told us the legislation in other states that this was modeled after used tests where they actually do measure reading, which is not what TCAP measures, as Mary just told you, who was the assistant commissioner at the Department of Education.
On the ability for children to be able to read, and frankly, it's about them being able to succeed all the way through K through 12 and beyond if they want to.
And you can see how easily Governor Lee tells this lie. It's very easy for him, and that should scare you.
Because at the end of the day, what we want is for every third grader to find success forward, and most importantly, for them to be able to read.
Can read.
Marissa, did you have another question, Marissa?
A lot of these kids can read.
So I was there yelling, these kids can read. And this was during a period where Governor Lee had long since stopped taking my questions. So he wasn't going to listen to me, but thankfully one of the other reporters picked up on it.
I'm sorry?
What do you mean by they can't read?
They fail assessments that indicate whether or not they are ready to move forward into the next
Again, not a reading proficiency test.
grade, and their ability to read and comprehend.
That's
at
not
a
what
level that
TCAP
should-
measures.
Channel 5, Chris?
Why do you keep saying
Oh,
that says
yeah,
kids
yes,
can't
sir.
read?
Yes, sir.
Why do you keep telling that lie? Why do you keep saying that? Stop that. Come on. Don't touch me. Why do you keep saying that test shows kids can't read, Governor? That's not what that measures. Are you trying to privatize our public schools?
So that was, I know he's not going to answer me when I do that, but that was sort of my way of telling you guys that he's lying to you. And he is undermining public schools intentionally to steer resources intended for especially our Black and brown kids in majority minority areas in Memphis and Nashville, where these voucher policies are. They don't want them in their own counties. When they passed those vouchers, Republicans didn't want them in their own counties. They want them in Nashville and Memphis, where the vouchers are, where the charter schools are, represented by Democrats, where they don't have to deal with the fallout. And we're talking about a lot of money. It's a heist. A lot of money, billions of dollars. And every single one of these efforts to undermine our public schools is another crack in the foundation of our public schools, our democracy. And a lot of it is ideologically driven because they see our public schools as these, left-wing indoctrination centers, which anybody who has a kid in public school in Tennessee knows damn well they're not. But that's what they make them look like. so that people get disillusioned with our public schools. And, the Moms for Liberty are out there saying, get our kids out of government schools and we need choice and vouchers. And now he's got his charter school appeal board set up to overrule local communities that don't want these charters in their schools. And around we go. And it's only going to grow. And all we can do is talk about it and try to open people's eyes to what's really going on in Tennessee. And I think there are other layers to this. Mary mentioned the religious aspect to it. I absolutely believe that's what's driving Governor Lee. He is a rich man. So I don't think he's filling his pockets through this, but I do think he believes this is his way of, advancing God's kingdom, to use Betsy DeVos's words. I'm not going to play you the clip. I've played it here a number of times. If you want to hear that clip and haven't seen it, Betsy DeVos using that phrase of why she became the Secretary of Education, I'm happy to send it to you. She said it out loud. She was here with Governor Lee, excuse me, pushing those vouchers. This is what they're trying to do. And Penny Schwinn changed our funding formula to make it so that more dollars would follow kids out of our schools. And then she left. And now she's gone at a think tank figuring out how to do it elsewhere. And the new hire, again, Lizette Gonzalez Reynolds, Mary just told you, comes to Tennessee from the education group TN Ed, which is the group Mary just said is trying to help them figure out how to change our accountability formula to further harm our public schools, lie to parents, and make people disillusioned with public education in Tennessee. That's what's going on. The foxes are guarding the hen house. The foxes are attacking the hen house. Tell your friends, and we'll see you next time.